Hello again, Regcast watchers. Well, you might be wondering today, wonder what they're going to talk about. Is it going to be about architecture? Is it going to be about sort of hardware or software or management or any of those things that we normally talk about? Well, the answer is today, it is all of the above. We're talking about workload placement. Basically, you've got what you've got, and we know very well that there's a pretty wide range of things that you have when it comes to applications and the hardware on which you're running it. So we're talking about the best place to put it. So let's get on with that today. So we understand that your platform and deployment models are going to coexist. There's there's not just one thing that's going to be the solution, despite what you hear in some other webcasts from those vendor-driven ones, where people just tell you that it's all going to be one thing or another. It's not going to be like that. You know that. You tell us that all the time. So that means you've got to make some decisions. So we're going to help you to make those decisions today. We're going to give you a sort of structure within which you can make those decisions. I'm not going to do it. The people with me are going to do it, because I don't know how to do it, but they do. So let's find out who those people are. And making a welcome return to the studio, back for his second go at this. Try anything twice, once to see whether he likes it, second time to see whether he was right. David Chalmers. David, welcome back.
Yeah, good afternoon. Good morning.
It went well last time, I thought.
I've enjoyed it. It's good fun. Looking forward to this.
I thought, well, let's see how it goes. Let's not make any decisions too quick. Now, remind people what you do at HP.
So I'm the Chief Technologist for our enterprise business in Europe, Middle East and Africa.
Now, you're involved in a lot of these discussions then, are you? You're actually in the room when these choices are being made by your customers.
Absolutely. So I do a couple of things for HP. I lead the pre-sales technology organisation who do most of the work, but I'm also a Chief Technologist in my own right, so I get involved with customers directly, and particularly in this cloud work placement issue, spend a lot of time with people doing that.
Is it when people make these decisions, does it all work out politely, or are you sometimes holding them apart?
It's about 50-50. At least halfway through. We'll talk about it a little later in the session about how we get to that point. Yeah, some of them get a bit lively. That's very true, and that's quite healthy.
It can be creative, just not too lively. Yeah, which can be sackable. David, thank you very much, and also you will recognise him from our old mates, Freeform Dynamics, back for his 450th Regcast. You've done about as many Regcasts as Ryan Giggs has played games with Manchester United, haven't you?
More than a couple of weeks and I start to get jittery.
Yeah. So, Dale, this is something that's coming up over and over again in the surveys that you're doing of Reg readers.
Yeah, definitely. There's systems are complex. There's new requirements coming in all the time. The whole thing is a constantly moving feast, isn't it? So everyone is having to make decisions on an ongoing basis in terms of where they put new things, what to migrate, and so on. So it's a pretty lively area.
Good. Well, we'll make it lively in the next hour for you. Now, first of all, though, we have to remind you about what's over our heads here. The most important button is the one where you can ask questions about this. We're sure there will be questions in your mind, so put them into our mind and we can help you with them. You can download the slides. You can also give us your feedback later. This is especially important today. I have a public service announcement before we get going on this. HP, we were discussing with HP about, we've got another one of these Regcasts coming up, and we were discussing with HP about what it's going to be about. And they said, well, why not ask the Reg readers? You know what you want to hear about. So what we want you to do as well is when you've listened to this, and also if you're listening to this on the on-demand version, this isn't live anymore, still give us a bit of feedback about this. Suggest something. We're crowdsourcing something along the private cloud, the infrastructure angle. Tell us what you want to know about. We'll do a Regcast for it. Now, where else do you get an offer like that? Where? I mean, where? Honestly, where? So please do that. Remember that. Keep that in your mind while you're watching today. So yes, let's get on with it then. And Dale, these are these routine deployment questions that you've come up with that people are thinking about. People are thinking, well, I make these decisions every day. I've been doing it for years. What's different now, mate?
A lot of analysis went into this, Tim. I mean, you won't believe
this is what you get. This is what you do for a job. I should have your job. I would like that.
There you go. This is what I was saying to. I mean, there's basically two questions, isn't there? You got new stuff you need to deploy. How do you deploy it? And you've accumulated lots of applications over the years, and they're all running on various systems. Time moves on. Technology changes. Decisions you made maybe 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, you wouldn't make the same decisions today. So you've probably got some of the wrong things running in the wrong place on the wrong platforms. So those are the two key questions. Where do I put new stuff? Is there anything I should be looking at migrating? And the overriding concern in all of this is we just got a lot more options now. I mean, we've been talking about private cloud and hosted cloud and all sorts of things for quite a while now. Today, unlike maybe even 3 years ago, certainly 5 years ago, these things are all pretty mature. So, you can actually use these things safely, they're predictable. You need to be a bit careful, as you do with any kind of technology decision, but you do have some good solid choices now that are all enterprise ready. And so, that's really what we're here to sort of have a chat through.
So if I were to shorten this Regcast, then, David, I could say, where should we run this new workload or application? Well, people have been making those decisions for a long time, so that works out quite simply. Are they running in the right place? If the answer's yes, then there's no conversation to be had. I'm assuming that for everybody the answer's going to be no. And so then the thing you do about it is you move it over to the other place. There we are. And so what are we going to talk about for the next 55 minutes?
Yeah, we're going to talk about the fact that what you will have are mixtures of pieces. Some of the things you have are in the right place and you want to leave them alone. That's absolutely fine. Some of them can be done much better somewhere else. And you've got to look at which pieces you move, where you move them to, what are the SLAs that you need to have with it, what's the risk profile, how do you decide which bit's going to stay, which bit's going to go. That's what we're going to talk about, because there are ways to do this. This is not a black art. We're going to actually talk about some of the ways that we see as being most effective.
And a decision-making process is not just a technical decision-making process. We're going to go beyond that.
Absolutely. In fact, I would say if you take one thing away from today, it's that point. This is a business decision that's influenced by the technologies that are available, not a technology decision for technology's sake. If you do that, I'll show you the problem you're going to get into as we get into towards the end of the webcast.
Good. And you've promised we've been promised a sort of a plan, if you know what I mean,
yeah.
a way in which you can help make these decisions. So let's see what that is. And if you're not getting it, ask us for it, because David, like you said, David's been in the room for these things. Now, Dale, honestly, have you been on holiday or something? Watching snooker on television or something? Now, I know I complain normally that your diagrams are too complicated, so I should be saying thank you.
Yeah, no, the thing is, Tim, your eyesight's going. I don't want to wear the glasses.
Go on, what are we saying here?
So, I mean, this is stuff that we're all pretty familiar with. When we're looking at where to run an app or workload, then obviously we need to make decisions around the hardware architecture x86 versus various risk options and so on.
Yeah.
Operating system, there's always a debate around Linux, Unix, and Windows, etc. And obviously platform software, .NET, Java. Yeah. All that stuff, everyone out there is familiar with all of that.
Stuff.
So that's the technical bit, I think, that we're not going to be talking a lot about today. But I just put it up there because there's a set of decisions that obviously...
We have to acknowledge that basically those decisions get made.
If we go to the next slide, this is what we're really going to be talking about. Yeah. So essentially, it's the way in which the delivery models have changed in a more sort of generic sense. So this is an upgrade of my quadrant that you may have seen on previous webcasts.
It's a sextant.
It's a sextant, yeah, exactly. So if we look at this, left-hand side, if we go from bottom to top, we're going from traditional architectures where we've got fixed stacks, an application running on a fixed set of middleware and hardware and so on. Maybe a little bit of shared storage in there, but generally speaking, that's your fixed, dedicated world. People have started virtualizing that, but virtualization doesn't necessarily mean you're making things that much more dynamic and flexible. You are to a degree, but the real flexibility starts to come in when you start to take it up another notch and move into this private cloud world. So this is where we're kind of breaking the links between hardware, software, and everything becomes a lot more fluid. We can do that in-house, which is the left-hand side of this diagram, but we can also take advantage of hosted options. And on the bottom right there, you've got traditional sort of co-location, and then next step up, you've got more kind of fixed hosting models, renting a virtual server per month according of a certain spec. But then you've also got the equivalent of, in effect, of your private cloud options. So that could be either a sort of flexible managed environment where someone is looking after it for you, or it could be a public cloud environment where you're dipping into someone's kind of big pool of resource. The thing is that most IT at the moment probably is in the bottom left, with a good amount in the bottom right if you're a larger organisation. Moving up into that middle tier, I had a bit of a debate about what we would call traditional. People call virtualized environments traditional.
It gets traditional quite quick.
Yeah. Anyway, it's familiar stuff, those bottom 4 blocks. The things that actually change the game in terms of decision making are the top 2. And the question is, how do we figure out whether we should be in the sort of bottom part of the diagram, or the top part of the diagram, or in the left-hand side or the right-hand side? And there's some pretty specific things we can discuss.
Is it legitimate, David, to say the top 2 don't interest me? I'm going to make decisions the way I did it before.
No, absolutely wrong answer. You've actually got to recognise that whoever you are, whether it's a small organisation to very large and complicated ones, you will have pieces of all of these inside your organisation. Culturally, you may choose not to host, or you may not choose not to outsource, so not necessarily all 6 of the boxes all of the time, but every organisation will have the hybrid environment. And if you don't take that route, you're missing out, because there are advantages to be gained from looking at these new workloads and workload placements, so long as you choose the right ones for the right reasons.
So the answer might still be no.
Correct. But
you've got to ask the
but
question.
It should be an informed no, not we don't do that because it's not what we've done. That's the wrong answer.
Yeah. Another one, you are admirable. It's a minimalist kind of deck you've got today, Dale.
Learning from the master.
So we're running from the orange to the purple.
Yeah.
Do you want to explain?
Well, a lot of what we're talking about is just making decisions a bit more objectively, and don't mean that in a more of a challenging way than a sort of criticising way. But historically, we've all been guilty of kind of going with the flow. We've historically put this kind of application or this kind of workload on this kind of platform, so you just do what you've always done. It's familiar, it's comfortable, you know what the risks are, you know what the costs are. Also, people tend to quite often go with their own interests, familiarity, sometimes even prejudice. There's a lot of warring goes on between Windows and Linux guys, for instance. So, various camps that tend to lend towards something being pushed in one direction or the other.
But here is that there's an advantage in that. If you have the skills in-house and the people who are comfortable in working that way, David, then there is an advantage in that. There is a business advantage, people knowing their roles and having the appropriate skills.
No question about that. However, if you stay with that, as Dale was saying earlier, the decision you made 2 or 3 years ago to invest in that and build those skills up may not be the right answer for where you want to go in the future. So just because you've got it and it's not broken, and therefore why would I fix it, not necessarily as a reason to stay where you are. You should still be willing to challenge those decisions. It's not broken, I'm not going to fix it. Well, maybe you should look at whether it needs to be moved, modified, or could be improved by using one of the new deployment models.
Do you sometimes think that your customers should be braver at this sort of thing? We've got politics in this, and you don't really want to expose yourself as being the person who says that everything is wrong.
And we all like security, we all like safety, particularly in these economic times.
We like to keep our jobs.
We like to keep jobs, we all want to keep working. And if you have a skill set in a particular technology and you are the expert in whatever that is, you want to see more of that being deployed. But from a business point of view, taking a slightly broader view, you've got to be prepared to challenge some of those, shall we call them, vested interests inside your organisation that say, actually, we should potentially look at blending this in with something else.
Who should be internally in the organisation? Who should be taking this sort of thing on then? Because workload placement sounds like it's not such it doesn't sound very radical. It just sounds like looking at a spreadsheet to make your decision. But suddenly we're into something where you have to be institutionally brave.
Yes, and you have to be prepared to recognise that there isn't one answer. The world will be more messy than we have been in the past, and getting comfortable with that is one of the things, and we'll touch on that in a little bit of time.
Yeah.
So this isn't a new thing, obviously.
No.
I mean, I've been around in this game long enough to remember when relational databases were these newfangled things and no one trusted them, and do we really want to bet a serious business application on it? After that, we had client server, then we had 3-tier architectures and web architectures, and we've had these iterations of developments. And I don't know about you, but I don't for the life of me think that what we're looking at today in terms of state of the art is going to be state of the art in 10 years' time. So this is a never-ending journey. Mm-hmm. But I think we have been through a period of kind of digging in for a few years, partially because of the economy and some other things that have been going on. But and I think people have maybe got a little bit too comfortable.
We spent a lot of time in this studio talking about sweating assets.
Yeah.
Which is basically don't change anything at the moment.
Yeah, and there's all sorts of reasons why that could be a good argument, but also there's some great reasons now why that's exactly the wrong answer. I mean, even some of the basic infrastructure stuff that I spend with customers, not a topic for today, but the old model, you say, sweat the asset, I've owned it for 4 years, it's free now, I've written it off, I'll keep it going, it'll save me money, almost certainly won't. For electricity costs alone will kill you. Updating your infrastructure is actually one of the things that will help you go forward and save you money and get you more flexible. And flexibility, as I'll come on to in a minute, is the key. It's being able to build that in.
But we're not talking about an all or nothing thing.
No.
Going back to those 6 boxes or sextant, whatever we call it, you will end up with, for the foreseeable future, things running quite happily in pretty much every one of those boxes, or at least on the left-hand side. So a lot of it is about choosing your battle. It's about prioritising. This is something we're going to get onto in a minute. What are the things that you should probably leave be? Sweat the assets. There is no real advantage. It's more trouble than it's worth to move. But what are the things that there is a real advantage, whether it's cost, risk, or flexibility?
I was reading on some of the Reg, the Reg readers with the comments that they were making around sort of Windows Server 2012. Last week, and so one of those things that they were talking about in relation to that when they were talking about using hybrid cloud models or anything like that, the guys who were pro were still saying we're pro, but as our servers depreciate, then we use that as the springboard to then start to make decisions. Now, are we saying they should hurry along with that and make those decisions sooner, or are we saying just be open to more decisions once?
If you're in a larger environment, you've got a constant stream of new stuff coming through that needs to be put on something. So if you go back to our original first 2 questions, that kind of new workload one is often the starting point. You have a new important app, or it might be something that you have to, you're going through a major refresh of an app, so you need to re-platform it in some way. Those things are going to happen anyway. That's the time at which you can look at these things, because you need to probably buy some kit and some software to actually put the thing on whatever. So the question then becomes, what do you put it on? The question of what should we be migrating, that's a value judgment based on some things that we're going to be talking about.
Based on the things that fundamentally the things
and
that we're talking about.
And a lot of things you'll say, no, we should not be migrating it. But there are some things when we actually go through an objective review, we'll say, well, actually, yes, we should, because it's costing us an arm and a leg to keep it where it is, for example.
And I think, just like I say, perhaps not exactly on topic for today, but the decision about, have I depreciated my asset, should I sweat it, should I keep it more, move it forward, is a more complicated decision today than it was 5 years ago. There are more factors that you have to take into account that you just didn't care about in the past. Electricity costs are today a fundamental decision about why you change your server or not, and probably why it makes sense to do it in 2 years rather than 5. The new carbon recording that's coming out 1st of October, that's going to hit almost every one of our customers, every one of your readers. They're going to have to report on their carbon reduction plans. You can't do that if you think in the old ways. And this is one of the ways why I think people can help.
And one of the reasons why also the decision becomes important is your slide here, the pace of change.
Pace of change. I mean, this is, unlike Dale, this is a slightly busy slide, but it was just trying to get the point across about how quickly things are changing. We are in an industry that tends to think in 2-year, 5-year cycles. I bought it, I'll build it, I'll deploy it, I'll sweat the asset, I'll refresh it later. And actually that doesn't work anymore. And my favourite examples there, those of us who are old enough to remember AOL and all those wonderful CDs that we had on the front of magazines for years.
They kept coming through the letterbox.
Absolutely. God knows, I shudder to think how much landfill we filled up with this. But anyway, it took AOL 9 years to get from nothing to a million concurrent online users. That's how long it took in that generation. Facebook, the poster child of the last few years, took them 9 months to go from nothing to 1 million online users. My example for this year is Draw Something. I don't know if you guys have got little kids, but this online game where you can interactively play a drawing game. It took them 9 days to go from nothing to 1 million concurrent users. How do you build and deploy infrastructure to cope with 1 million users in 9 days? You can't do it the old way. You've got to do it in a different way. Because the problems or the challenge or the opportunity of the internet and the internet age is success can be as painful as failure. If you don't gear up to think differently, you'll never be able to grab an advantage of that sort of example inside the organization. So you have to think differently. You've got to be prepared to embrace this change rather more quickly than traditionally you would have thought about.
But so most people will never actually have a spectacular success in that way. But what you're saying is you have to be open to the fact that if this occurs, you can deal with it.
And one of the things, we did a survey about 6 months ago, and we surveyed a whole bunch of our customers and prospects, but we talked to the business people and the technical people separately. And we were looking at pace of change. And there was a remarkably consistent statistic that came out that said business people want to move the IT-based systems 5 times faster than the IT people think they can keep up. So if the business want it tomorrow, IT might get to it next week. If business can do it in a week, it'll be a month or more before. Very consistent model. You just can't do it the way you used to. You have to be able to think differently, and cloud deployments is one of the opportunities that you get to do that. And it will move a lot faster than it used to.
It's a nice 5 times rule of thumb, isn't it? It's sort of managed disappointment, isn't it? Structuring that.
Yeah,
but
5 times faster.
Yeah, so on one hand you sort of manage their expectations a little bit, so you can't have it tomorrow. On the other hand, there are maybe, it's legitimate now to look at what you could provide in 48 hours.
And I think a lot of it is removing constraints. It's not sort of sizing things as we did 10 years ago. Yeah. Based on a sort of pedestrian growth, because things sneak up on IT departments really, really quickly. Suddenly the appearance of HD video makes network bandwidth quality of service important in some organisations. Opening up your network to mobile apps, for instance, BYOD type stuff. Suddenly your Wi-Fi network gets swamped, or your backends get hammered in a way that they never did before. You've got a lot more hitting your Exchange server, for example. And it's things like this that, and they come in waves, and I think it's hard to predict what they're going to be, but you need to get your options open, I think.
Very much so. We are an industry, I think, that is prone to fashion in technology, and you've got to be prepared to see through what's a fashion and a fad to what's a genuine business change and an advantage for your company, and what you should be prepared to take on. But thinking about dealing faster is the crucial point.
Right, so now let's look at what those decisions are that have to be made, because then that will lead on to how we make those decisions. Yes, I will.
Thank you.
And there we go. So this is how you've split it out.
Yeah, so we see the world basically in these 4 fundamental building blocks in terms of technology. There will be traditional technologies, and you will continue in your organizations to have those. Those people who tell you the world's going to move wholesale to cloud, it's just not going to happen. There are very good reasons why you want to keep some of the technology very close to you, business reasons, political reasons perhaps. There are reasons for adopting cloud inside your organization, the private cloud model, being able to get advantage of that delivery as a service, turn it on when you need it, turn it off when you don't, but you have complete control over it. You may choose culturally to have that hosted for you, managed by somebody else, because you don't want to have armies of operators anymore. And there's the public cloud where people will actually buy services on a much wider scale. The difference for us is SLAs, because those different models come with very different SLAs and very different ways of managing and monitoring the SLAs. The reality is you will have all 4, so looking for people that can help you recognize that. Don't get seduced into the, I've only got one offering, so I'm going to tell you my public cloud can do everything, or I'm a private cloud provider, I can do everything.
You hear a lot of that.
Well, the old cliche, if all we got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, applies in spades in this circumstance. You've got to look past that and say, that might be appropriate, but then again, it's got to blend with the rest of my world. I've got to manage it as a coherent whole, not another island of technology, and we'll touch on that in a moment as one of the major challenges that this technology brings with it. But make the decisions around SLAs, and look at what's actually going to be important to your business is the thought process that we like to see people coming through.
do IT departments get too enthusiastic about their SLAs sometimes and aim for unrealistic amounts of availability and service?
I think not so much the IT departments, but I think the business users. I think if you ask any business user how important is this,
switched on.
Yeah, it's 100%, it can't be anything else. So then you have this rather more sensible discussion about, well, really? So how much are you prepared to pay for that 100% availability? Actually, is 4 nines, 5 nines, 3 nines, 6 nines the right answer for that business function at this time? Let's have a rather more sensible discussion. And that has to be both business, because they pay for it, and technology, who've got to work out how to deliver it.
And so one realistic thing that we could do is to just draw some rough graph of this is how many nines, this is how many these many nines will cost you for this.
Yep, and therefore understanding what you have and how it works, as opposed to, well, we did that a few years ago and Fred's not with us anymore and we're not quite that doesn't cut it anymore. You've got to have an understanding of what you do.
But you do need to know what you need, what your requirements are, so that's where the business decision part comes in. We've moved forward from the slide, but one of the things I picked up from David's last slide was on the left you're very much in total control. You engineer something to meet whatever SLA you want.
Correct.
On the right-hand side, you get what you're given. So if you sign up to Office 365 or Salesforce.com or whatever it happens to be, it's a service and there's no real negotiation. The question then becomes, well, is that service level and the way it's managed good enough for what I need? And unless you know what you need, then you can't answer that. But that becomes more of a qualification question. If you're in the middle somewhere, then you can actually sit down and negotiate. If you're dealing with more bespoke hosting, you can say, well, actually, I need a bit more than that, and you'll get charged more. Greater resilience.
We cover this debate when people Salesforce.com and Office 365, and what they're promised and what they're getting, whether it's good enough for them. You got any? If you have any experiences with that, we'd be pleased to hear them. So, now looking within the cloud computing options, 4 ways to do it.
Yeah, and this is where you start to get down half a level into some of those approaches. So we see people doing all of these. So do it yourself. So this is the classic, it's my stuff, I'm going to build it to my spec, to my SLA. Works fine, nobody's suggesting it doesn't, but it's hard because you've got to have all of the skills in-house. It's almost certainly more expensive, and it's capital intensive. So you've got to buy stuff as opposed to taking it on as an OPEX through a service. So we see more and more people today saying, I'm only going to do that if I can see real benefit from it. Not because I always did it that way, not because I know I can, but because there's real benefit in for me doing that. We see some organizations, this is the hammer, you've got a hammer that looks like a nail. I'm going to go to one vendor, they'll sell me a solution based on their stack and possibly their hardware underneath it. From some of the vendors, again, it'll work, but the lock-in is hideous in my view, and that's one of the things we see people railing more and more against. I'm not going to lock myself in here because actually, might not be today, but eventually that's going to become a deeply painful thing. I'm going to pay for it eventually. Always happens.
It's come very quickly into the cloud discussion, hasn't it, Dale? There's the idea of cloud lock-in to be something that is a deal breaker.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's come through really loudly and clearly in some of the recent Reg surveys. I mean, people are worried about simple things like, how open is this thing? Can I integrate it? Does it have the APIs? Does it have the tooling and stuff to integrate with stuff in-house, but also other cloud services, because no service stands in isolation. The other thing are simple things like, how is my data held? Is it held in a model that allows me to extract it and load it into some alternative system at some point? And a lot of this stuff is, seriously proprietary out there. So you just got to be really, really careful.
Yes.
I'll come to that fourth option in a moment. You can, the third option is almost the traditional SI one. I don't want to have the skills to build it, but I'll pay somebody else to build it for me. So you end up effectively like a version of an outsourced do-it-yourself. You get the best of breed technologies, which used to be the right way to
They can do it cheaper. They can take some of the expense away.
Well, they hopefully have got economies of scale. They hopefully got skills in all of the areas, not just some of them. But again, there's a degree of lock-in there in that the technologies they pick are going to be under their control, probably. But you're also locked into the SI as much as you are to the technology itself. The integrated by design one is, I think, where the industry is trying to get to, certainly where we start to see this maturing of the cloud world from what was a very proprietary space 3 years ago, and it has moved hugely in 3 years, to one where you can now see much better signs of standardization appearing. I'd use OpenStack as the example of that. 3 years ago, it was nothing. It was an idea on a piece of paper, and it's been the fastest growing open source project ever. It's now dominating the cloud landscape as the core architecture that does hold out the promise, and it's probably at that stage today. It'll be next year before you really see true interoperability and cloud brokering being delivered as standard as opposed to a one-off as it is today. But that really does hold out the promise of where I think you'll see most of the industry going down that route. Eases up on the lock-in because you're not tied into a vendor. You'll be able to move, and the difference will be what have I wrapped round about it. So we see encouraging signs that there are ways that this is going to get better. It's already improved today. People moving away from the proprietary stuff towards the open. At least I would suggest the sensible vendors are, the ones who are not trying to lock you in. And that, I think, holds out great promise for people. The technology pieces will be there to help you make the right decision.
Now, clearly you have an interest in this, but we're saying one of the things about knowing what to do is knowing what you can't do. And in cloud, for example, there's a red line around regulation for some people in some ways. Would you also say that there's the open architecture has to be a red line as well? You don't, if it's not going to be open and interoperable, you don't do it for cloud at the moment.
That's absolutely my view. I think we're at the crossover point today. We're in the maturity of the technology because you've got to be able to get the functionality you need. And last year you probably had to do that largely with proprietary style technology still. This year we're absolutely making that crossover, and today you can now get that functionality with more and more of the open technologies. From next year onwards, why would you buy proprietary technology if the open stuff's better?
So I've got a slightly different view, which is a bit more pragmatic, which says, I agree with you, don't do it lightly, but Salesforce.com would not exist if we applied that kind of principle, because Salesforce.com started out as a totally proprietary environment. It still is actually very proprietary. It's a lot more open in terms of its APIs now than and interfaces than it was before, but it's still a highly proprietary environment. You just make a decision though, and you say, well, what can I live with? I like your diagram here. Just looking at it as you were talking, I'd maybe that right-hand column, I'm wondering if we might think of that as maybe something underpinning the others, because I think of that right-hand column as being an architectural approach.
I think it should be, and I think it will be. I'm not sure it is right now.
But ultimately, something that came out of some Red Reader research, and certainly my view, is what we should be aiming towards is putting some kind of architecture in place which allows you to actually coordinate what you're doing in terms of even in-house developed bespoke stuff. If you apply the right kind of standards and approaches and so on, stitch that into your architecture. Also, anything that someone builds for you, or packaged applications, or various forms of cloud services. So, in many ways, look for. And OpenStack pretty much ticks most of those boxes in theory. It's still very focused on cloud deployment today, but it has a potential to actually become, almost like a sort of bus in some respects.
Correct. And when you see the strength of the vendors who are now absolutely putting themselves behind it, so we've done it for several years. More recently, you've had people like IBM coming in behind it. That sort of momentum in our industry very rarely fails to become the dominant player in the space.
The point I was trying to make is I'm not sure that the architectural approach necessarily excludes taking advantage of point solutions and
absolutely. I said the world will be hybrid, right? So it's making sure you do that. But if you were trying to move in a general direction, you want it to be open, you want it to be standards based, and then you fit the other pieces in. The challenge right now is about management, because the least mature bit of this is how you manage that mixed up environment.
Absolutely.
Right? And that's getting much better very quickly, but that's the one where you have to look for the vendors who allow you to manage not just their stuff, but other people's stuff.
And that's going to be a cost in your attention, in lost opportunities, time and money.
Do you know, we've actually got cloud legacy now. We've come across this. People who've made point solutions over the last 3 or 4 years, early movers that have taken on board hosted services, but none of them work together. Some of them will integrate with your Active Directory on site, some of them won't. They have their own sort of separate identity authentication system. Some of them support standards, some of them don't, or support different standards. Absolutely. And people are sitting there, they've got silos of cloud services. They really have.
It's like David's time to 1 million users, isn't it? Time to legacy now. If you've got cloud legacy,
Very
please
different.
let us know. We won't. Yeah, we'll feel sorry for you.
And this might be contentious, but I would argue that there are actually some cloud services that people are using today that they should migrate from
Yes.
to equivalent cloud services,
Yes.
because they're not really that future-proof.
Like what?
Absolutely.
Very quickly.
No, I'm not going to get into specifics.
Okay.
But,
I think you see more of that actually in the very early private cloud deployments,
Yeah.
where people actually put it together themselves. They knew what they were trying to do, and the aim was honourable and good, but the technologies they used and the approaches they used actually have meant it's in a silo.
Okay.
I was thinking more of those services that kind of sprang out of the lightweight consumer-y type world and got adopted by users and sort of productionized, but they really weren't designed on the right kind of footing for scaling up.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more enterprise class options now.
Yeah. Let's have a look at this, because you're in the room when people are making these decisions. As we established, this is what happens in the room.
Yeah, so this is where it actually comes right down to the key point for me. This is where you actually get the benefit. So what we've discovered, and we've done this a couple of thousand times now as an organisation over the last several years, this is the sort of process that we've found works best for most organisations.
Right.
It's actually sitting down and having a discussion in your business, not in your IT department, about what you have to offer to the business to allow it to run, which services do you have to do to allow your business to function, and then having worked that out, which ones of them are core to your business, which ones of them make you you, where there's competitive advantage, there's differentiation in the business, the things that are critical to your ongoing business success, and what things are context, things that have no differentiation particularly. You have to do them well. You may well find that some of them are regulated, there may well be compliance issues, but they're just things you have to do. And if we look at, so a good example for me, last year I did some work with a major oil company. They were quite well advanced in this. They'd done quite a lot of good thinking about, so what do we have to deliver? And they'd worked out there were 85 things they had to deliver as a department to the business to make the oil company work. 6 of them, and only 6 of them, were core to making them who they were. 79 of them were stuff they had to do, from email to ERP to CRM was in the stuff we have to do category.
That's not core.
That was not core. There's no differentiation in it for them. Core stuff, I mean, without giving away any secret, was things like seismic research. There's a logistics package in there. That's the thing you have to work out. And what we've worked out is that process of working out what's core and what's context may sound very scary and difficult, but actually it's not. We've worked out a way of doing this in one day. If you take a workshop approach and you get the right people in the room, and back to your question right at the very beginning, how interesting can this collaboration...
So most of the people in the room are going to leave the room saying, I'm just context now, I'm not core.
You've got to be really clear. You get the right business level people, the right decision making level people in the room, and in a day you can work out approximately what's core and what's context, and therefore have a way to start the process. Now that doesn't mean to say that things that are context aren't important. They are important, but they're not differential, and therefore they're far more susceptible or far more likely to be outsourced, to be put in a cloud service. They can sustain a lower SLA. 4 nines is probably acceptable for an email system, for example. But if you're drilling an oil rig, that probably needs a 5 nines or better. You can actually work out the differences. It doesn't mean that those things aren't important, the people driving them, but if you're going to invest your money, you want to invest it where it's going to make you different and better and progress, not just the stuff you have to do and do well.
How many people do you have in this room?
Tends to range between 6 to 10.
It's not very many.
Not very many. Plus there's about 3 or 4 people from helping, because this does need some facilitation, and it almost always needs external facilitation. People like Dale in there helping to actually take this stuff through.
You fancy this job there?
It's
I've done it on quite a few
it's an interesting process, because when you can if you get to the end of the day, and actually the way we do it is we take all the chairs out of the room. Just do a little aside. You can't sit down, right? You've got to stand up all day. It's a bit like the Privy Council. Doesn't have shorten the decision-making process. But you stand up and you work your way around a series of semi-fixed points around the room as you go through this core versus context process. And you end up at the end of the day, usually, once or twice you think, no, that didn't work, we have to try it again, usually because we don't have the right people in the room. And the critical people who don't see why they have to come are usually the senior business decision makers. IT people are there in droves. because they want partly to protect themselves, and partly because they should be controlling this.
Yeah, well, you might genuinely believe that you're not context, and you don't want some business decision maker to be telling you that you're not fundamental anymore.
But so getting the right mix of people in the room and the preparation for it, that's what it's all about. It's getting the right people in the room that's the core thing.
How do you decide what's core and what's context? What's the rule of thumb?
Does it add business differentiation? Does it make me me? So if I'm a bank, what makes me different from my competitor bank? So yeah, we all have to run current accounts and we all do trading, and am I differentiated there? No, I have to do it at least as well as they do, but am I different? What makes me different in this marketplace? Is it my speed of reaction? Is it my geographical coverage? Is it my culture to my... Whatever it is that makes you you, that's the thing you're actually looking for. And what you'll typically find in the workshops is you'll end up with some obvious no-brainers at one end and some obvious no-brainers at the other, and a bunch of stuff in the middle. Not really quite sure. We need to spend a little bit more time working on that. But from an IT perspective, you've already got the early adopter candidates. You're at either end in terms of where you're going to start this process. Because as Dale mentioned earlier, you don't do all of this at once. This is an iterative, never-ending story in some senses. The other thing that we find makes a difference is this something you should do with your partners, not just in your business. So that's not just the facilitation piece, but not with suppliers, not with people who are trying to just sell you stuff on a transactional basis. You've got to have them. Typically, we don't have procurement people in the room because they have a particular angle. This is about looking forward, not about driving the right deal on the table. So he's dealing with partners, and I have personally a big thing about the difference between a partner and a supplier. To be a partner, yeah, you've got to be a great supplier. That's the ticket to come play the game. But a partner is somebody you share things with, both ways. The partner, so we share, as an example from HP, we're sharing experience. We've done it a couple of thousand times, we've seen some of the lessons, we'll share that with you. We'll give that for free, and if the business has got the courage, and it needs to have, they should be looking to share with the partners where they think the business is going to go. That's not something you do with a supplier, because ultimately that'll end up probably in a bad place for you. But with a partner, that sharing makes a huge difference to making this process work.
I never sit in a studio with someone in the number 3 chair where you are, who says, actually I'm not a partner, I'm a supplier. Everyone claims to be a partner.
Yes, and I appreciate and actually support the cynicism that we should apply to that, because let's be honest, as an industry we've probably abused the term partner for a long time. But if you think about who genuinely are your partners, most decent sized organisations will procure from tens if not hundreds of people, but they'll have partners on the fingers of one hand. Right? And if they think that through, who are my partners, and get them in the room, you can do this even faster. Right? So not suggesting for a moment that this is trivial or easy, but the rewards are huge, and you absolutely can make real progress very quickly if you go down this approach.
Actually, as a precursor, it's worth actually, something we encourage all the time, is thinking who your strategic suppliers or partners are, because it is easy just to sort of put a dollar or pound value on it and say, well, we spend most with these guys, therefore they must be the most strategic partner, supplier, or whatever. It doesn't always work that way. It's the guys who you can actually have a conversation with. And to reinforce that, I did quite a few sort of CIO architect roundtables where you literally get sort of 12 people in a room from different companies kicking around ideas. I did one last week. It wasn't on this topic, it's on something else, but it comes up all the time. Is, you know, I do a lot as an analyst. I brief with vendors a lot, so I know, you know, everything that HP's up to, and you know, the other guys in technology space. I hear all the best practice, all the latest ideas and stuff, and I go to these workshops, and it's amazing actually how much people don't know. They don't know what they don't know. And so my advice always is, look, you know, who are, you know, 1 or 2 key players in whatever space it is you're operating in that you trust. Get them in, have an open conversation. You know, they'll bring some good pre-sales guys, project guys, whoever. You know, it needn't be an overt selling activity.
Yeah,
use it.
We have a question. Jonathan's question from that is exactly this: is there some sort of formula, best practice advice that you can lean on for this? Because I imagine it would be an extremely stressful environment to be in a room with no chairs, feeling all at sea with people saying you've got to make the fundamental choices about the future of your organisation's IT in the next day.
But that's why facilitation is critically important.
Yeah,
and a bit of prep up front. I mean,
Correct.
warm people up in a few days before in terms of what to expect. If there's some key information they need to having in mind, there are everyone's got their own methodology, but there are ways of doing this. But use suppliers. It needn't be a huge consulting exercise.
No, use partners.
Use partners.
Don't use suppliers.
No, use suppliers.
Because in my head,
no, I agree.
Suppliers come with a very specific agenda. They want to sell you more stuff.
Yep.
Okay, partners want to do that as well, but the difference for me is they're prepared to wait and partner with you and walk away if it's not the right thing.
Yeah, you got to trust them to be able to say, support a decision which says, well, actually, we should leave that.
Yep.
Yeah.
All that stuff
we're not
there.
Gonna make any money out of it, but it's the right thing for you.
You should do this. You shouldn't do it with us, but you should do this. That's where our partner.
Steve, another question. Small business. Can small businesses do this? Is this really a worthwhile?
Yeah, I think if you look
process?
at the yes, they can. And we've done it with pretty small organisations. We did it with a charity organisation just across the river from where we are today, which IT terms was 10 people. It was a small organisation. The whole company was 60 odd people. But what they were trying to work out is, actually, if we use it on the next slide, perhaps we use this as an example. What they were trying to work out is, and we see this all the time, people have a reasonable understanding of where they are. Usually it's actually less complete than they think it is. So that's part of the prep and to actually work out, so where are you really? They have a reasonable idea, or at least through the workshop we'll help them shape where they want to go. What would a utopian future, a year, 2 years, depending on their horizons, look like? And therefore, what are the sensible steps you go through to get there? So yes, you can do it for very small businesses. I think for real SMEs, once you get down into the tens of people, they're far more likely to go for a complete cloud solution, just because they don't have any of the infrastructure inside at all. But for
at that point, there's much more value in simplicity of management, isn't there?
And they tend to be smaller, newer. They tend not to have so much legacy. So there are other slightly different dynamics there. But once you get to the M and the large, then you'll almost certainly have the hybrid pieces. So it's helping people recognise where you are, where you're going to try and get to. So the old cliche, if you don't know where you're going, any path will do. So let's have a map about where you think you're trying to get to. Culturally, what's your approach to having stuff inside as opposed to outside? Are you willing to have stuff offshore? Are you willing to need to have it all onshore? What's your regulatory environment? There's constraints that vary by organisation.
Quick question on this one. Are we just talking about making some slightly smarter decisions, but we're always doing this? How often are we going to have to get in the room with no chairs?
We've typically do it with people every couple of years.
Couple of years? That's more often than I thought it would be.
More often than you think, because as to Dale's point earlier, this is changing, my point with the slide, it's changing faster than it used to. And the answer of 2 or 3 years ago is not necessarily the answer of today. Might be, but spending a day or so sanity checking that, huge, well worth the investment.
And to be prepared to throw everything up in the air every couple of years again, that's stressful.
To challenge your own thinking.
To challenge your own thinking, yeah.
Not necessarily you're going to change everything, but to say, you know what, actually, our balance between inside and outside may change. We see many organisations where the chief exec changes, brings a different culture to the company. Might need to change some of your thinking. Being able to adapt more quickly.
I think now is quite an important time to do it, though, because there are quite a lot of things happening. There's the whole mobile thing, there's the cloud thing, there's a lot going on data management, which changes what you can and can't. So a lot of lines are shifting, which changes the economics of making a decision one way versus the other way, but also huge impacts in terms of being able to say yes to certain business needs and even business
why
wants.
our conversation makes sense now, whereas 2 years ago it wouldn't really have been so much on the agenda.
And for leading edge or for progressive people who are happy working at leading edge, these are conversations they were having sort of 2-3 years ago. The big difference, and I don't want to stress this, I can't stress this too much, is that a lot of these technologies and service options have actually matured to a degree now, where there's really no good reason not to not to consider them.
And in fact, and that both is a great thing, but it also brings one of the challenges. But if I just bring up one of the points. So this is where we've come from, where we had technology silos. Exactly as you said at the beginning, we bought a piece of hardware, we had an OS, we put some app on, or software on top of it, and we built it, and it was great. And that's a very good way to do a single thing repeatedly. There's good reasons to do that, but you ended up with all of these silos. Typically, they were very difficult to cross-manage, they didn't talk to each other. That's what we're trying to get away from. However, what we do see a lot of companies ending up with is cloud-based silos, because they made an investment that said, actually, I'm going to buy Salesforce, to use your example from earlier. I'm going to build this piece of private cloud because that looks like a good fit. And all they've done is create new generations of silos. Absolutely the wrong answer. You've got to make sure you try not to. Now, most people will have this, and that's okay so long as you can work out how you're going to continue to go forward. How am I going to improve this? So to get to your point, should I look at what we've already done? Well, probably you should, because it's not going to fit into a well-managed environment. Now, today that takes a bit of work because the tools are still maturing. Some vendors are further ahead than others, but it's looking to understand where you're going to get to that's important.
So that's the big flashing warning sign if you think you're going to build yourself a set of cloud silos.
Yep.
Dale, you like to recommend the idea of establishing a beachhead and building out from that when it comes to evolving the IT department. I take it that's not the same thing.
No, it's absolutely the same thing. I mean, you're not going to suddenly, overnight, put some kind of architecture in place with management tools and middleware and all that kind of stuff, and then have everything magically stitch into it. And this is why you go through the core versus context stuff, and that's against the background of, everyone's got a list of things that need to be done that don't actually exist or need to be upgraded or whatever. So it's a pretty dynamic thing. So you prioritise some things that you would be doing anyway, and then if you do rather than dealing with them one at a time, the advantage of doing the analysis is you build a picture and you say, okay, now we've got a number of things here which we need to address. If we think about how we deal with that in a holistic way, the chances are we can actually put some kind of platform or management framework in place and actually start building an architecture which we can start dropping these things onto. And then over time you can expand that beachhead. It's the same basic approach.
Yeah, and I think you use a good word there, architecture, because in some ways that will scare a lot of people, because it tends to imply big, rigid, slow to change, and that's the antithesis of what we're actually talking about here today.
It is.
And what I'm trying to get across to with this slide is actually the biggest challenge you will face is taking your people with you. Because partly technical people tend to have entrenched skills. They're good at whatever it is they do and they want to do more of that. We all want to stay employed. But equally, you've got to make sure your people are open-minded enough to say, you know what, the way we did it might be the wrong answer. Now, we're not going to throw it all away and have a revolution overnight. Nobody can afford that. The risk is too high. You shouldn't do that. But we may need to evolve quickly to something new. And that means our people may need to think differently than the way they did before.
So I see Andrew here comes in with his comment. He runs runs quite a large IT department, with 100 people in the IT department, big IT department. And he said he assumes a vision, a common vision that everyone can sort of hold on to. And he said he sometimes feels like he's the civil service of the business. And they're sort of working towards this goal, irrespective of who's in charge. Is this a good thing or it's a bad thing to have this sort of like tunnel vision idea of...
Tunnel vision, yes.
Tunnel vision was a bad idea.
Vision, yes. Tunnel, no. So I think you've got to have an idea where you get to. You've also got to be willing to say, well, where we thought we were going to get to a year ago or 2 years ago, well, we may need to tune that. This is not a simplistic linear view of the world. Things change too fast.
And that's a difficult process, isn't it? So that people can understand that, because also if it involves disappointing a certain group of people because they're less favoured than they were a couple of years ago, you've got to be able to handle that.
You've got to be able to handle that, which is why you've got to get the senior people in the room.
Right.
So make sure your people are on board. The other thing that we always end up with is, I don't mean to put the cliche on the table, but it always ends up as a journey, and your organisation, I'll guarantee you, will be different from everybody else's, and that's okay. Historically, we've been through an industry whereas if you weren't doing the right architectural design, if you weren't moving from codicil to SQL databases, if we go back far enough, if you weren't on the fashion wave, you were doing it wrong. This isn't like that. This says your journey will be different from other people's. Your combination of traditional and private and managed and public will probably be different from other people, and that's okay, so long as it's the right answer for your business.
Is that really true? When you're in that room and you come to the end of the day, don't you end up deciding basically the same thing most of the time?
Not the same thing, no. I mean, there's common themes, yes. People want more flexibility. They want to be able to pay more on an OPEX basis than a CAPEX business. But every business genuinely has a different mixture of the pieces. They're coming from a different place. They've got their traditional is different from my traditional, your traditional. So having an open mind there, is it going to be radically different? No. We can see, the common themes that work and the things that don't work. But everyone is subtly different. And making sure that you're okay with the fact that you're a bit different from everybody else's, that's okay. Can get a bit interesting when you get some of the business leaders in the room who do the airplane magazine reading bit and say, well, we're not exactly like that, so we must be doing it wrong. Not necessarily at all, which is why they have to be part of the process. And just perhaps the last comment from me before we get there is, I quite like this little cartoon, because for me it actually sums up one of the dangers here. Just like every other technology fad we've been in, and I've been doing this 35 years, putting it in the cloud doesn't answer the problem. If it's the right answer for what you're doing, fabulous. It can add huge value to your business, and doing it with the right partner will make a big change to that. But it's not in itself a panacea that will fix anything. It's part of your overall architecture and part of your overall solution set that's right for your business.
There's a lot of conversations with people who went through the big outsourcing wave and were in the room for those decisions. Yeah. A lot of this is very similar, isn't it? Deciding where the priority is, but also having to accept that just by sending your mess to somebody else.
Yeah, I think I would draw one little difference between that wave and this, because the big outsourcing wave tended to be the business people saying, you know what, I'm fed up with this IT stuff, I'm going to give it to somebody else.
Yeah.
And they did it to the IT people. This, when it works well, is done with the IT people. This is in the room at the same time, not I'm going to pass it out. It's far more collaborative than that particular outsourcing generation was.
And I think the motivations are different as well. A lot of outsourcing going back over the years has been driven purely by cost.
Yeah.
There is a cost dimension to this, but the allowing the business to and users, allowing people in the business to do things next week that they can't do this week, by accelerating things, by taking advantage of this stuff. That's the kind of stuff that matters. People want responsiveness. Time to benefit is that the consulting term, isn't it? So you want to be able to do things quickly, do things that you couldn't otherwise do. That you'd never build a system to do that kind of stuff in house, but actually by subscribing to a cloud service, immediately all your users within days or weeks now are able to do something they couldn't do before. And it's those kind of things that dictate what you prioritise, what you don't, which is why this core versus context is so important. So you're focusing on the right things.
When you've decided that something's context, how does that change your thinking about it? Just to be really basically specific and explicit about this.
You tend to focus more on cost and risk as opposed to value. It's as simple as that, really. If you think of a triangle for decision making, value, cost and risk, the differentiating stuff, the core, you put more emphasis on value. The other two, you want it to cost less and you don't want it to break.
Yeah, it probably moves its position on your priority list.
Yeah.
Right. Do I invest in it today? Well, actually, I'm going to do the core stuff first.
And a cost and risk play off. There might be a good case cost-wise for moving it, but actually the risk of moving it, might outweigh that. So you might live with that additional cost. But actually, once you've moved it, you're not going to be able to do anything that you couldn't do before. So the value thing is kind of irrelevant in that context.
Well, we're near the end now. We've only got a few minutes left. Dale, summing up on this. This can easily become something that gets a bit airy-fairy, wishy-washy. We tried as hard as we can to keep it down into these are actual decisions that you're going to have to make.
Yeah, and there's the interplay here between all the business stuff we've just been talking about, prioritisation and so on, and actually the technology side of things. What this diagram is really summing up are some things that we've known and loved for ages. Which platform should we use, driven by dependencies and skill sets and that kind of stuff. But actually over on the right-hand side, when we're looking at delivery models, the business thing should always lead, but actually you'll find that there are some technical considerations in there as well. So if you've got a particularly volatile application, an outward-looking web app, for instance, that goes up and down depending on campaign activity, it's probably going to gravitate towards the top right-hand corner, hosted dynamic sort of cloud environments. If you've got something that's highly regulated and very compliance dependent, then it's probably going to be down in the bottom left, not necessarily. If you've got something which is very comms-centric, that's maybe something to consider putting in the cloud, because cloud providers, by definition, they have secure connectivity across boundaries.
From what they're good at doing.
Exactly. So if that's fundamental to your application, consider sticking it in the cloud. So, but let's not let's get away from trying to make all these decisions on a pure technical basis.
Don't make a list of these things and tick off against the list. Oh, we need to put it there.
Exactly.
That's very often what you see from the vendors, though, isn't it?
Well, that's where you get back to the supplier versus partner. A supplier will try and constrain you to what they're good at because they want you to buy more of it. But that's not good enough. You need to deal with somebody who takes a wider view.
And generally speaking, if people go through this process and they go through it honestly, do they end up getting it right? Because the nightmare is you go through a process, this process, and make your plan for the future, and it turns out to be horribly wrong.
No, we've seen the success rate is very high because it's an incremental process. So you're not. This is not the big outsource. All my eggs in one basket. This piece is going to go here. That piece is going to go there, and your ability to therefore be flexible. To think, actually, hang on a minute, that turns out to be the wrong choice in that little piece. I can change that piece. So it does allow you a lot more flexibility in the past. This is not the big bet scenario. This is actually a whole series of joined up little bets that end up making sense.
I've got a feeling quite a few people watching this have had enough of their big bets for the time being.
Risk profile's too high. Doesn't make any sense. You've got to be able to evolve, but evolve much faster than you did before.
Okay. Well, we hope that's been helpful for you. We're out of time, guys. And so here's your further reading. Download the slides. David's terrific. Dale's I just like the look of them today. I enjoy that very much, and it's all that nagging about your slides are too complicated, Dale. And so it's my fault if you didn't like them. Thank you very much for joining us. Now remember on your feedback, if you enjoyed this today, but especially if you didn't, tell us what you want us to do a Regcast about within this kind of area, and we'll do it for you. I mean, it's a terrific offer. It's fantastic. We'll do everything apart from come round your house and do it for you in person. So please do that. Let us know what you think, and join us for our next Regcast. And from David and Dale and from me, goodbye.